the gas station stranger, it was just past midnight, and the old highway was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural, as though the world itself is holding its breath. The fluorescent lights of the gas station buzzed faintly, illuminating the cracked pavement of the parking lot. Mark, a 22-year-old college dropout, had been working the graveyard shift at Harry's Gas Convenience for 6 months now. He hated the job, but it paid the bills, and he figured no one would bother him on these remote night shift secs, maybe the occasional trucker. The night had been uneventful so far. Mark spent most of his time scrolling on his phone and sipping stale coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the burner for hours. The tiny gas station smelled of cleaning chemicals, fried food, and cheap air freshener. Outside, the night stretched like an endless void, with no headlights in sight, no sound except the wind occasionally howling through the cracks of the glass doors. At around 2:15 a.m., Mark heard the chime of the bell above the door. Startled because he hadn't seen any cars pull up, he looked up to see a man standing in the doorway. The stranger was tall and gaunt, with skin so pale it seemed almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. He wore an outdated gray suit, the kind Mark had only seen in black and white movies. His eyes were dark and sunken, and his thin lips were curled into what could only be described as a faint, unsettling smile. His shoes clicked against the tile floor as he walked toward the counter. "Evening," Mark said, forcing himself to sound casual. "What can I get for you?" The man didn't reply. He stopped in front of the counter, his head tilting slightly, as if studying Mark. The silence stretched on for an uncomfortable moment. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and raspy. "Coffee." Mark blinked. Sure. Over there," he said, pointing to the coffee station by the wall. The man didn't move. "Could you get it for me?" the man asked, his tone polite but cold. His gaze never left Mark. Mark hesitated. Something about the man made his skin crawl. But he shrugged it off, chalking it up to sleep deprivation. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, stepping out from behind the counter. As he poured a cup of coffee, he felt the man's eyes boring into his back. He tried to shake off the unease. When he turned to hand the cup to the stranger, their hands brushed for the briefest moment. Mark recoiled slightly. The man's hand was ice cold, like he'd been standing outside in freezing temperatures, but it was a warm summer night. "Anything else?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man shook his head and took a slow sip of the coffee. His lips curled into that same unsettling smile. "Good coffee," he said, his tone almost mocking. Mark gave a nervous laugh. "Thanks. Been sitting there all night." The man didn't laugh. Instead, he stared at Mark for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the door. Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. As the man reached the door, he paused. Without turning around, he said, "You should leave before 3. Mark frowned. "What?" The man didn't respond. He stepped out into the night, the door chime echoing behind him. Mark walked to the window, watching as the man walked across the parking lot. But instead of heading toward a car, the man kept walking straight into the darkness of the highway. Mark waited, expecting to see headlights from the man's car, but none appeared. The man had vanished. The rest of the shift was uneventful, but Mark couldn't shake the stranger's words. "Leave before 3. What the hell did that mean? Was it some kind of prank? A threat? Mark glanced at the clock. It was 2:45 a.m. He told himself he was being paranoid. The man was probably just some drifter trying to mess with him. But as the minutes ticked by, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over him. The gas station suddenly felt too quiet, too isolated. At 2:50 a.m., the lights flickered. Mark froze. A power surge, he told himself. Nothing weird about that. But then he heard a faint tapping sound coming from the glass door. His heart racing, Mark looked up. At first, he didn't see anything. But then he noticed Ite's handprint on the glass, smudged and wet, as though someone had pressed their palm against it. The parking lot was still empty. Mark grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, his breath hitching as he scanned the lot. There was no one there. But when he turned back to the glass door, the handprint was gone. He stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. His mind raced. He considered calling his manager or the police, but what would he say? That a creepy guy told him to leave, and now he was spooked? At 2:55 a.m., the tapping started again, this time from the window near the back of the store. Mark's blood ran cold. Slowly, he made his way toward the sound, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. When he reached the window, his stomach dropped. Standing just outside was the man in the gray suit. But something was different. His eyes were darker, almost black, and his pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. His lips were moving, but Mark couldn't hear what he was saying. Mark stumbled back, his heart pounding. "What the hell do you want?" he shouted. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he placed his hand against the glass. This time, the handprint stayed. The lights flickered again, plunging the store into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the man was gone. By now, it was 2:58 a.m. Mark was shaking, sweat dripping down his forehead. He kept glancing at the clock, willing the minutes to move faster. He didn't know what would happen at 3, but he had no intention of finding out. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. The store was plunged into total darkness, save for the weak beam of Mark's flashlight. He fumbled for his phone, but the battery was dead, though he'd charged it earlier in the night. A sound came from the back of the store, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down Mark's spine. He turned toward the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam illuminated the aisles, but there was nothing there. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Mark backed up, his breath coming in short gasps. The footsteps stopped just as he reached the counter. He swung the flashlight around, but there was no one there. "Leave," a voice whispered, so close it felt like it was right next to his ear. Mark spun around, but the store was empty. The clock struck 3. The growling intensified, and the air grew cold. Mark's flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in total darkness. He felt something brush past him cold, like the man's hand had been. Then, he saw it, glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness. Mark screamed and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The eyes moved closer, and he felt a cold hand grab his shoulder. Suddenly, the lights came back on, and everything went silent. The store was empty. The clock read 3:01 a.m. Mark quit his job the next day. He never found out who or what the stranger was. But sometimes, late at night, he still hears that faint capping sound, as if the man in the gray suit is still waiting for him. The Hospital Shadow, Chapter 1. The Night Shift. The hospital corridors were quiet, almost too quiet. Maya tightened her grip on the clipboard in her hand as her footsteps echoed softly down the long hallway of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. It was her third month working the night shift, and she still hadn't gotten used to the eerie emptiness that consumed the building after midnight. The dim fluorescent lights cast long, flickering shadows across the walls, making the pale green paint look sickly. Maya glanced up at the clock hanging near the nurse's station. 2:43 a.m. The graveyard shift, they called it, but she was starting to think the name had a more literal meaning than she initially believed. St. Augustine was an older hospital, built in the 1950s, and much of it hadn't been renovated in years. The walls were scuffed, the floors creaked in certain spots, and the vents made unsettling noises when the wind blew just right. The wing Maya was working in tonight Wing C was the oldest and least used section of the hospital. Most of the rooms were unoccupied, with the occasional patient admitted only when the newer wings were full. It wasn't just the building's age that gave Wing C its reputation. The staff whispered about strange happenings, shadowy figures seen out of the corner of their eyes, objects moving on their own, and cold spots that sent chills down even the bravest nurse's spine. Maya had brushed off the rumors as exaggerations. Hospitals were inherently creepy places, especially at night. But tonight felt different. Chapter 2. The humming. As Maya made her rounds, she approached room 311. It was supposed to be empty, but as she passed the door, she heard a faint, melodic humming coming from inside. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and peered inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the pale glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. The bed was neatly made, the monitors and equipment untouched. The humming had stopped. "Hello?" Maya called softly, her voice trembling. No response. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning with unease. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she couldn't deny the strange sensation that someone or something was watching her. Chapter 3. The Shadow. By 3:15 a.m., Maya had almost convinced herself that the incident in room 311 was just her mind playing tricks on her. She was tired, overworked, and the hospital's creepy atmosphere wasn't helping. As she returned to the nurse's station, she noticed something odd. One of the monitors, the one connected to room 313, another supposedly empty room, was registering movement. The motion detector was blinking steadily, indicating someone was inside. Maya frowned. She knew for a fact that room 313 was unoccupied. She'd checked it herself earlier in the night. Grabbing her flashlight, she made her way down the hall, her pulse quickening with each step. When she reached the room, the door was ajar. She hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty bed, the sterile equipment, and the vacant chairs. But then, in the far corner of the room, the light caught something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, darker than the darkness itself, stood motionless in the corner. It had no discernible features, no face or form, yet it exuded a palpable sense of malice. Maya's breath caught in her throat as the shadow began to move. It slid along the wall, defying the direction of her flashlight, as though it had a will of its own. "Who's there?" Maya demanded, her voice shaky. The shadow stopped, then began to grow, stretching upward until it reached the ceiling. The temperature plummeted once more, and a low, guttural whisper filled the room. Maya couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent shivers down her spine. She stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight. The shadow lunged toward her, and she screamed, slamming the door shut and sprinting back to the nurse's station. Chapter 4. The files shaken, Maya decided she needed answers. She rummaged through the hospital's old patient files, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences in Wing C. The records were dusty and disorganized, but one file caught her attention. A patient named Eleanor Carter, who had died in room 313 nearly 10 years ago. Eleanor had been admitted for a routine surgery, but had suffered complications during the procedure. The doctors had tried to resuscitate her, but she died on the operating table. According to the notes, Eleanor's family had been unable to afford a proper funeral, so her body had remained unclaimed in the hospital morgue for weeks before being buried in a pauper's grave. Maya felt a pang of sadness. She wondered if Eleanor's restless spirit was still lingering in the hospital, seeking closure. But as she read further, she discovered something even more chilling. Eleanor wasn't the only patient to die under strange circumstances in Wing C. Over the years, several patients had reported seeing shadows and hearing whispers before their deaths. Some had even claimed to feel an unseen presence holding them down as they took their final breaths. Chapter 5. The final encounter. Determined to confront whatever was haunting the wing, Maya returned to room 313. She carried a small vial of holy water, an impulsive purchase from a nearby churchant, a prayer she'd scribbled onto a piece of paper. The room felt colder than ever, the air thick with an oppressive energy. Maya stepped inside, her hands trembling as she held up the vial of holy water. "I don't know what you want," she said aloud, her voice wavering. "But you don't belong here. You need to move on." The shadow appeared almost instantly, materializing in the corner of the room. It was larger and more menacing than before, its dark tendrils reaching out toward her. Maya recited the prayer, her voice growing stronger with each word. The shadow hissed, recoiling as she sprinkled the holy water in its direction. The room seemed to tremble, the walls groaning as the shadow writhed and shrank. With one final, ear-piercing shriek, it vanished, leaving the room eerily silent. Maya collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know if she'd truly banished the spirit, but for the first time all night, the oppressive feeling was gone. Epilogue. Maya transferred to a different hospital a week later, unable to bear the thought of working another night shift at St. Augustine. She never spoke about what had happened in Wing C, but she couldn't forget the shadow or the chilling whispers that still echoed in her dreams. And though she'd left the hospital behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. The Warehouse Lights. Chapter 1. The Graveyard Shift. The rain pattered softly against the metal roof of Thompson Logistics' sprawling warehouse on the outskirts of town. Ben adjusted his flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the dim light of the massive, mostly empty building. The rows of shelves stretched endlessly in all directions, filled with dusty pallets and forgotten inventory. Ben had only been working the graveyard shift for 3 weeks, but it already felt like an eternity. The job was simple: keep an eye on the place, make sure no one broke in, and report any unusual activity. But no one told him how unnerving it would be. The warehouse was old, with exposed pipes snaking along the high ceiling and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. During the day, it was a bustling hub of activity, with forklifts beeping and workers shouting. But at night, it was a different beast entirely. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of metal or the distant hum of the ventilation system. Ben didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but something about the place felt wrong. He could never quite shake the feeling that he was being watched. Chapter 2. The first flicker. It was just after 2 a.m. when the lights started acting up. Ben was sitting in the tiny security office near the main entrance, scrolling through his phone, when the monitor showing the warehouse floor flickered. He glanced up, frowning. The overhead lights in one of the far aisles were blinking erratically. This wasn't unusual. Maintenance was always complaining about the ancient electrical system. Still, it was his job to check it out. Grabbing his flashlight and radio, Ben stepped into the warehouse. The air inside was colder than usual, and the faint scent of mildew hung in the air. As he walked down the central aisle, the flickering lights grew brighter, the flashes casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. "Hello?" Ben called out, more to fill the silence than anything else. His voice echoed through the vast space, but there was no reply. He reached the aisle where the lights were malfunctioning and shone his flashlight down the row of shelves. Everything looked normal, just rows of dusty boxes and crates. Ben sighed. "Probably just a loose wire," he muttered, turning to leave. That's when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. He froze, his grip tightening on the flashlight. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the aisle. "Hello?" he called again, his voice trembling slightly. The tapping stopped. Ben took a hesitant step forward, his flashlight beam sweeping across the shelves. "If someone's in here, you're trespassing. Show yourself." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, as he turned the corner, he saw Itae's single light bulb, swinging violently back and forth, its harsh glow casting distorted shadows on the walls. But there was no one there. Chapter 3. The shadow Ben returned to the security office, his nerves on edge. He told himself it was nothing, just the wind or a draft. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He sat down and checked the security cameras. Most of the monitors showed the same static view of empty aisles and dimly lit corridors. But when he switched to the feed from the far corner of the warehouse, his blood ran cold. There, just beyond the edge of the frame, was a shadow. It was tall and humanoid, standing perfectly still at the end of an aisle. Ben leaned closer, squinting at the screen. The shadow didn't move, didn't sway or flicker like the other shadows cast by the flickering lights. It was solid, almost as though it had weight. "Is someone messing with me?" he muttered, grabbing his radio. He called the night supervisor, but there was no response. The line crackled with static before going dead. Ben looked back at the monitor, but the shadow was gone. Chapter 4. The lights go out at 3 a.m. The power cut out completely. The entire warehouse was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from Ben's flashlight. He cursed under his breath, fumbling for his phone, but the battery was dead. Of course. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the warehouse in an eerie red glow. The dim light made the shadows seem longer, more menacing. Ben heard something, a faint rustling sound coming from the far end of the warehouse. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way toward the noise. As he walked, he noticed something strange. The emergency lights were spaced evenly throughout the warehouse, but some areas were darker than others. It was as if the shadows were thicker in certain spots, almost alive. The rustling grew louder, and Ben's flashlight began to flicker. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Up ahead, just beyond the reach of his flashlight, was a figure. It stood motionless, its silhouette barely visible in the red glow. Ben's flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, he saw it clearly, a tall, faceless figure with elongated limbs and a head that seemed to tilt unnaturally to one side. The light went out completely, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. Chapter 5. The Chase. Ben turned and ran, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty warehouse. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away. The sound of footsteps followed him, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was behind him was in no hurry to catch up. He ducked into a side aisle, pressing his back against the shelves as he tried to catch his breath. The air was icy cold, and he could see his breath fogging in the dim light. The footsteps stopped. Ben peeked around the corner, but the aisle was empty. He felt a moment of relief until he looked up. The figure was perched on top of the shelves, its long limbs dangling over the edge as it stared down at him with hollow, empty eyes. Ben screamed and bolted, weaving through the aisles as the sound of metal creaking and boxes tumbling followed him. He didn't dare look back. Chapter 6. The Exit. When he finally reached the exit, he slammed into the door, fumbling with the lock. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him several tries to get it open. Just as he threw the door open, he felt a cold hand brush against the back of his neck. He turned, but there was nothing there, only the dark, empty warehouse. He ran to his car and didn't stop until he was miles away. Epilogue. Ben quit his job the next day. He never returned to the warehouse, but he couldn't escape the nightmares. And every now and then, when he drove past the building, he swore he could see the lights flickering inside and the shadow watching him from the window.